Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I'm diving into recreating a 19th century stocking that I was lucky enough to examine in person. And it's the end of week 2 of Tour de Fleece, so I'll be sharing what I have done in this week's spinning journey. So let's get started. Last week, I had a guest on the podcast, Cristiane Goeltenboth, who brought her great-grandmother's stockings to my studio. Her great-grandmother, Cristiane, was born in Germany in 1860. She immigrated here to the U.S. in 1890 in order to marry her fiancé, who had immigrated here a few years earlier. One of the pairs of Cristiane's stockings used pretty standard techniques as I would have expected in a pair of stockings from that time period. Rather than doing mirrored decreases like an SSK and a knit two together, she would just use knit two together everywhere. The other pair was not only knit with a finer yarn, the techniques used were more unusual. There were mirrored decreases. Not only that, but they were double decreases, and they were placed in unusual locations for stockings. And because they included her maiden name initials sewn on with beads up at the top of the stocking, and they had been saved, we thought maybe they were her wedding stockings. They had certainly been worn enough to be repaired. There was darning evidence, but not to the extent that the other pair of stockings had been repaired. I was so intrigued by the construction and the techniques that I decided to replicate them as part of my long-term project to understand the evolution of hand knit socks and stockings. Obviously, I don't have a written pattern for this stocking, but I do have some photos that I took of the stockings showing what techniques were used and where, and then some measurements to guide me as well. Because the stocking was cast on at the top, I needed to understand how that stocking was begun. What was the cast on method used? And I had to chart out the lace stitch patterns that were in the stockings. One of the most interesting features of the stocking was with the turned hem. It was done differently than I'd ever seen, and it requires more skills and special techniques than a standard hem would require. So that was the first thing I needed to figure out. And then the next thing would be to chart out the lace pattern at the top of the stocking, which ended up surprising me in a couple of different ways. So let's go to the overhead, and I'll show you how I worked through those early challenges of replicating that stocking. So to get started on this, I want to start at the beginning. I want to chart it out, figure out how many stitches I need, but also how many rounds this original was worked, how each component was done. So what's interesting about this is that the facing part of the hem is quite a bit shorter than what you see on the other side. And so I wanted to see how long it went here. And this is about 4 rounds. And then you alternate a knit two together with a yarn over all the way around in order to create that turning round. And so then I was looking at how long this elongated strand was. So I worked that out, charted out what I thought it probably was. And then I looked at this photo of the stocking, and again, I have a yarn over, knit two together, alternating here. There's a few rounds, and then there's these diagonals so that they're offset each time, and then they go straight up, and then you have the diagonal, and then you have a few rounds, and then again you have this set of eyelets. So it's charting that out, and then I knit up a sample that I thought was pretty close. I could see that I hadn't quite hemmed it down low enough on here. There are a couple of things I did. I realized I ended up with 1 round short here than I had intended, and then these little strands were a bit shorter. So I thought, well, if I knitted a round longer and then I bring these down, another couple row or two, then I'd probably end up with something that was similar to that. And so yeah, I went back and I was looking at all this again. And then I noticed this. this does not look like what I have on the back side. I'm like, wait a second, what's going on? And so I looked a little bit, I could see in the edge of this photo, the other stocking. It does not have the same stitch pattern. Instead, it looks like this, and which surprised me that I hadn't noticed it. I was so focused on the construction method and the techniques that were used in this stocking, I did not pay attention to the stitch pattern. It was like a lace stitch pattern, whatever, you know, look at the construction. And so I thought, is this the same pair of stockings? Or were they two stockings that went to different pairs and one of each is what survives? I don't know the answer to that. It could be. It's a lot of work to know stocking, and maybe she was working out what it was she wanted to do with the lace and you know, didn't get it right and decided to do something else here. Nobody else was going to see it. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But I did know that I wanted to chart this out. I thought this is it's prettier. So I wanted to chart that one out. So I charted it out the way I thought it was supposed to go. It looked like you have an eyelet with a knit two together, and then you work a plain round, and then you have, you know, a knit stitch, and then a yarn over, knit two together, a plain round, and then two knit stitches, a yarn over, a knit two together. You know, that's what I thought was happening, is that there was one eyelet every other round and it just moved over and then it started over again. So I started the stocking. I started it and I knit all the rounds I thought I was going to need for the hem. I started the eyelets. I did my diagonal. I started the second eyelet of the diagonal and I thought, there's too much room in here. This is not what's going on. And so I realized what's going on is that when you get to this furthest one over here, you're also creating the one on this side. So there's one eyelet created in one row, and then the next row you're going to create two eyelets. So it's more compressed than what I originally thought. So I had to count the rows in the original stocking just to confirm that that's what was going on. And then I swatched it out, and this looks more accurate. This is the actual stitch pattern and how it's supposed to be done. So I had to rechart it, and then I'm going to have to pull out these rounds right here and then reknit those before I can continue on. So this is what I have so far with the stocking. I've got far enough along in the stockinette portion. Pretty soon I'm going to be ready to start doing calf decreases. So right now it's pretty boring. It's going fast, but it's pretty boring. But I wanted to show you what was going on here at the top, how I handled this provisional cast on. Normally with a provisional cast on, you cast on exactly the number of stitches that you need. And you might use waster, and there's a variety of methods you can use for provisional cast on. What I did in this case was I actually used a long tail cast on. So this red yarn was my thumb yarn, and I used the project yarn for my index finger yarn. I cast on half as many stitches as I needed. And then when I worked the first round following the cast on, I worked it as a yarn over, knit one, yarn over, knit one, in order to double the number of stitches. The way that these two stitches are connected is to the red yarn is between the stitches through their running threads. That's what this contrast yarn has. So when I'm going to do the hem, I will use my sewing thread to go through those loops that are caught by the red yarn. That's how she had sewn the original. And so I thought the easiest way of doing the provisional cast on was to alternate between a yarn over and a knit one, and then to double the stitches. So if you look at this stitch right here that looks kind of wide, there's just a strand of red yarn underneath it. That was a stitch that was created with a yarn over. So they're only connected every other stitch between the stitches. Just because I know somebody will ask me down in the comments, the charting software I use is called Stitchmastery. I'll leave a link to the website down in the show notes. There are lots of different charting applications out there that you can use to chart knitting patterns. Some of them are free, or some are free for limited use, and some are paid either by subscription or just a flat fee. For a lace chart like the one in the stocking, the symbols are close enough to keyboard symbols that you could make a chart like this in a spreadsheet. You could use a spreadsheet for color work patterns as well. That's really easy. Just make each cell the color that you want it. What I like about Stitchmastery is that the library of symbols that are available for cables, brioche, and other more complex textured stitch patterns is just enormous. So you also have the ability to create custom symbols, but 99% of the time the symbol you want is already there. You only pay once for the program. I bought this when it first came out, like more than 10 years ago, maybe even 12 years ago. And it's gone through several updates over those years. Never had to pay for it, the upgrade. I've switched from PC to Macintosh, never had to pay for that switch because I changed operating systems. I'll leave a link to her website, as I said, down in the show notes. Not sponsored, it's not affiliate. I just really like that charting software, and every time I show an example of a chart, somebody asks me what that software is. We're coming to the end of the second week of Tour de Fleece. So Tour de Fleece coincides with Tour de France and running from July 1st to July 23rd. So my Tour de Fleece goal is mainly just to do something spinning related every day. And most days I do actually spin, but I've also been scouring raw wool, as well as trying out some new tools and techniques for preparing fiber for spinning. So let me show you what I was up to this week. So in preparation for Tour de Fleece, I had scoured some 4 to maybe 5 ounce samples of different unusual or rare wool breeds. And the process I used was one that was new to me. And it worked so much better for me than my previous attempts at scouring wool that I decided I wanted to tackle scouring an entire fleece. So I have I had 2 raw fleeces in my closet here in my office. One of them was the very first fleece I ever bought, which was a BFL Romney cross. And I bought this back in 2019, so 4 years ago. It was 3/4 Blue-Faced Leicester and 1/4 Romney. And when I laid my eyes on it, it was love at first sight. The problem was I didn't know anything about selecting fleece or anything about those 2 breeds, or what the cross, what a fleece from a cross of those 2 sheep would be like. I just knew that I had to have that fleece. But because I was struggling to be able to scour raw fleece here in the setup that I had in my house, I was reluctant to try to tackle that entire fleece. So it's just sat in a bin for 4 years. And every year I worried that if I didn't scour it soon, it would be too late. I had heard all these stories about how lanolin can harden and get tacky if the fleece sits too long without being scoured. So there was a certain amount of worry involved in not scouring it. And then previously I'd had worry about the process of scouring it. So I was ready to tackle that this week. So I took it down and just refreshed my memory about how much wool there actually was. It's a 4-pound fleece. So I washed it over the course of several mornings because I can do about 1 pound at a time with my setup. And I didn't want to just keep I didn't want to do it all day long. I wanted to break up the process. So it came out really clean and beautiful and soft, and I was in love with it again. But I saw all of those curly yellow tips, and I was a little worried about whether or not that was normal. I had had a similar experience with these little curly yellow tips with the Swedish Fennel sampler that I had spun up in the first week of Tour de Fleece. So I sort of thought maybe it was normal, but I also was just worried that this was a sign that I waited too long to scour it. So there's a spinning group associated with the Weavers Guild that meets once a month. And in the summers, they meet at a park. And the meeting for this month was on Tuesday. So I took my spinning wheel so I could spin in the company of other spinners, and I took a pound of that scoured fleece to show to everyone there to see what they thought. And the first thing that I was told by someone who was a really excellent, experienced spinner was that I'd done a really good job scouring the fleece. So yay! And she said that the yellow tips were from the sun. It's just kind of sun bleaching, and that is totally normal. So it is a different color though than the rest of the fleece. So I wanted to do some experimenting to see how I might process the fleece and to see how that would transform those yellow tips. So this is some of the raw fleece, and so you can see those little curly Q-tips. This is probably from a darker gray area of the fleece. It's not one of the lighter ones. You can see there's some darker here. You can really feel the lanolin in here, and has that wonderful sheepy smell to it. This is from one of the lighter areas, but this is once it's been washed, and so you can see those curls, and then you see that these kind of golden tips at the end here. It'll be interesting to see on this, you know, I can scour this a little bit and see what happens to the tips on these, because they look very similar in color to the wool that's underneath there. So what I did was I used like a tool that's called in a process called flicking, where I can open up the ends of the little skinny locks here and fluff everything up. And so when I do that, you can still see that there's, you know, yellow area, and then there's a silver area underneath. So you can still see that yellow. But then I took out my combs, those big dagger looking things, and I combed some of it, and it just, you know, as you comb back and forth, it kind of blends together. You can see a little bit of yellow tingy in there, but you can also see some of the silver. And depending on what color of the gray that you're working with, I would imagine the yellow is going to be more or less noticeable. So this is something, this is combed, but you can really see the crimp still in it. And one of the things that I was unsure about is whether I could even card this fiber, because when I look at one of these locks, it's about 4 inches long when it's relaxed, but when it's stretched out, it's about 6. And there's kind of a limit to the length of fibers that you can card, but that limit is based on the relaxed length of the staple, from what I have been told. So I have a little bit, a sample that has been combed, and then I will do some carding of some of the fiber, and then I will compare the results. I might try hand carding, but also drum carding, just to see what I think of the process and the results, and do a little bit of sampling with each of those as well. I'm really excited to see what this fleece becomes. My hope is that it will become a sweater at some point. So that's the wool scouring. For spinning, I did a few different things with a couple of different breeds. Most of the fiber that I've purchased in the past couple of months has either been raw fleece, like 4 or 5 ounces of it, that I've had to scour and then either card or comb. And in some cases, I bought washed fleece, which I will still have to card or comb. But there was one vendor at Shepherd's Harvest that was selling yarn, single breed yarns, but also roving in some cases. So when she gets her fleeces milled, sometimes there's leftover roving, and then she just sells it in 1 ounce increments. So I have a perfect amount of a prepared Clun Forest, which is a Welsh breed, that I'll be able to spin up pretty quickly because I don't have to process. It's only 1 ounce, and I'm interested in seeing how it knits up. It has a feel to it, sort of like it's a medium type of fleece. So it's not really fine, but it also doesn't feel super coarse. So I'm interested in knowing how this spins up. I'm always on the lookout for sort of medium real wools that I think might be nice for a sweater, because that's the kind of project I tend to knit. And so I'm kind of looking for a breed that I would enjoy spinning and that would enjoy wearing as a sweater. And I'm looking at this one to see if this might be it. So this is the result of the Clun Forest roving that I spun. It was a roving, so it was a woolen preparation. I could have used the long draw method of spinning to create a woolen spun yarn, but instead I decided to use a worsted method of spinning called short forward draw. So, you know, this combination of woolen preparation but worsted spinning. And I was able to spin it pretty fine. So rather than doing a 2-ply yarn, I did a 3-ply, and I prefer 3-ply yarns anyway. So I'm kind of collecting the breeds of sheep that I've enjoyed spinning and knitting, and that I'm happy with the yarn, so that going forward, when I decide, oh, I want to make spin a sweater's quantity worth of yarn or something, that I will have some breeds that that I know I like, and this is absolutely one of them. So this is the undercoat of the Norwegian Spelsau. So somebody asked me how did I actually separate it, and I really didn't do anything to separate. You can see a little bit right here of the outer coat. So it's very long, and it does have a different texture. And it's, you know, it's the outer coat. It was sitting on top of this undercoat. So as I was pulling the outer coat off to comb it, it just naturally separated. So you can see this little bit right here is kind of the some of the outer coat, but they have a very different texture, and they just kind of clumped together. So I had just over 2 ounces, I think, of this undercoat. So I divided it roughly into thirds, so about 0.7 ounce for each. So this bunch I'm going to try combing. I'll see if I can comb it. But for the other thirds, one of them I ran through my drum carder. So I have this very kind of light bat because there wasn't a whole lot of fiber. So I have this little bat, and then I used my hand combs for the first time to create rolags. So basically you have a mini bat on your comb, and you roll it up into this kind of cigar-like thing. When I spin it, I'll be spinning off the end here. So that's really, the fibers are separated, and they're kind of all going in this direction, not completely, but pretty much. But as I spin it, I'll be spinning off this end, and that's going to just pull it from the inside and pull it out, and that's really going to create a difference. When I spin the bat, I can choose how to spin this. I could roll this up into a giant rolag and pull it out from the center, or I could strip it into, I could like divide this, it's so little, in half, and then just spin off one end of it. So pretty much spinning in the direction that it was carded. So I have some choices for how I do the bat, but for the rolags, I'll be spinning off this way. When I comb these are absolutely going to line up the fibers, and then I will spin them in that direction. So this is the result of spinning the Norwegian Spelsau. And this is a dual-coated sheep. It's what's called a primitive breed. In Norway, it's considered a land race breed in Norway, which means kind of the original breed when humans migrated into Scandinavia. It's a descendant of those sheep, and it was just, fend for yourselves, sheep, and develop the way that makes sense for your environment. And so that's what this kind of sheep is. With this dual coat, this stronger, straighter outer coat that protects from the weather, and then there's this downy undercoat that provides warmth. And so this kind of a sheep breed will grow its coat it grows fleece all summer long, and then it stops growing in the fall, and because it's what it needs for the winter to keep it warm, and then in the spring it starts growing again. And so then there's a break between the old growth and the new growth. The new growth is the rise, and then there's this break. And what's supposed to happen is that it will gradually, the old stuff will just fall off. It'll look like the sheep is molting. But humans could do what's called roving, and they could pluck that off, and it would just come apart where that break is. And then they could gather that all up and use the fleece instead of trying to get it as it falls off, and it would be in rough shape by then. Or it could be sheared. So what happens is that if you shear a sheep that's like this, that has that break, you get a lot of what looks like second cuts. It looks like the shearer has gone over and sheared close to the skin, and then it looks like they kind of went through again, and on a second pass you get these little shortcuts. There was a ton of that in this, and I thought, man, why is there so much? And then I started thinking about it. I'm like, oh, this is a primitive breed. Maybe it was just that it was sheared, and so it took off not only the old growth, but that tiny bit of the new growth. When you're shearing right close to the skin, you're going to take off that new rise as well. And so I think that that's what happened with this. So there was quite a bit of waste in the various stages, more waste in some, depending on how I was preparing it, than others. So this I had combed. I talked about this last week. This is the outer coat, and it had several different colors. So as I was combing it, I had these little nests that I created of combed fiber. I kind of put them in gradient order from darkest to lightest, and I spun them in that order, and then I plied them in a way that the single strand was being plied on itself to create a triple strand, a 3-ply. It's called chain plying. It's like kind of like crocheting with giant loops, and then having the strands twist together as you do that. So that creates the combing, and then the method I spun it created what's a worsted preparation, worsted preparation with the combing, and then I spun it using a worsted spinning method. For the undercoat, I wasn't sure what to do, and so I decided to try combing a third of what I had, using the drum carder for a third, and then hand carding a third, just to see what the difference should be. I had just over 2 ounces of the undercoat in total, so I divided it into roughly about 0.7 ounces each. And the result is, with the combed version, I only have just almost 0.4 ounces. So I lost about 45% of it from waste as I was combing. For drum carding, I have, let's see, what do I have? I have some notes. I have about 1/2 ounce left. So I lost some of it, not nearly as much as I lost with this. And the reason I lost quite a bit is because some of it, there's short fibers, and they just stuck to the carding cloth on my drum carder, which meant I had to try to get it out in other ways. So I lost a bit of fiber here. On the drum carder, you're creating what's called bats, and it's like a big rectangular piece of carded fiber. So carding is kind of aligning the fibers. It's aligning them in a different way, and usually you run things through the carder a couple of times. So I could take this rectangular bat off, and because there wasn't a whole lot of it, I could just run it back through again in the same direction. So I was carding it in the same direction multiple times. And then as I spun, I used what's called the long draw method. That's a woolen method of spinning. So carding is a woolen method of processing the fiber. And I used long draw, but I kept that sort of rectangle of the bat. I held it in that direction as I was spinning. So it was disorganized. It was more disorganized than it was certainly with this, which everything was aligned. but there's still some alignment, not some disorganization, so it's a little bit loftier, a little bit more air in it. And then for this one, I use the hand cards. So you're working with a smaller amount of fiber than you are in the drum carder, where you can load up several ounces. So working with small amounts, and again, combing it several times, kind of back and forth in the same directions. And then it gets rolled up into like a cigar. But when you spin it, you're spinning off this way, perpendicularly. And so that really causes the fibers to be disorganized. With the hand cards, I had really very little to any waste at all. I still have 0.67 ounces of fiber resulting from this. So let me give you a closer look here. You can see, I hope, that this is, a smoother yarn. And it's kind of a little bit denser. It still has, give to it, softness, fairly fine wool. This is the one off the drum carder. And so it's sort of smooth, but not super smooth. And it's just, and it's a lighter, you see how it's a lighter color even? And I think just because there's more air in it, those dark fibers aren't as close together. And so, it doesn't look as dark in the finished yarn. And then this one is the one that was done with Rolex. And this one is a little bit lumpier and is a little bit, hairier. And it just, has a slightly different appearance even from this one. So it's just interesting to compare those different processes and the result. One of the things I'm really enjoying about Tour de Fleece is seeing how I'm able to include spinning into my daily fiber life without sacrificing knitting time. In the past, I've kind of felt like I was trying to juggle them and that one was being sacrificed for the other, but I'm not feeling that. At least not at this point in time. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Or you can join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.